The sun hung low in the Montana sky, painting everything in gold the day Tabitha Morris buried her dreams alongside her husband. The year was 1879, and at 24, she had already been branded with that awful word, widow. The townsfolk of Copper Creek whispered behind her back as she stood alone by the fresh grave, her spine straight as a fence post, despite the crushing weight of grief. Poor thing, they said. She still believes John will come walking through that door. But John wasn't coming back. The mine collapse had taken him, along with 12 other men, leaving Tabitha with a ranch she barely knew how to run, debts piling higher than the nearby mountains, and a stubborn flame of hope that refused to die. 3 months, she whispered to the wind as she made her way back to the empty ranch house. 3 months to prove them all wrong. The Morris homestead sat on a beautiful piece of land just outside of town, 160 acres her husband had staked during the first wave of settlement. The modest 2-story house needed repairs, the barn roof leaked, and the cattle herd had dwindled to barely 30 head after John had sold most of them to invest in the mine that ultimately killed him. Tabitha lit the lamps as darkness fell, her slender fingers trembling slightly. The house creaked and settled around her, too big and too quiet now. Her reflection in the window glass showed a woman still young, despite the worry lines forming between her brows. Dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her mother's locket the only adornment against her black dress. "I can do this," she told her reflection. "I have to." The next day dawned cool and clear. Tabitha dressed in her work clothes, a split riding skirt that had scandalized half the town when she'd first worn it, and a simple cotton blouse. Practical clothes for practical work. John had taught her enough about ranching that she wasn't completely lost, but running the place alone was another matter entirely. She was checking the chicken coop when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Sheriff Miller rode up, his gray mustache drooping with his frown. "Morning, Mrs. Morris," he said, removing his hat. "Thought I'd stop by, see how you're holding up." "I'm managing, Sheriff," Tabitha replied, straightening her shoulders. "What brings you all the way out here?" The man shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Well now, I've been talking with Mr. Reynolds at the bank. He's concerned about the loan payments on this place." "The loan payments are my concern, not his," Tabitha said, lifting her chin. "The agreement gives me 6 months after John's passing." "Yes, madam, that's true, but Reynolds thinks it might be kinder to help you sell now, before things get harder. Winter's coming, and a woman alone is perfectly capable of honoring her husband's dream," Tabitha finished firmly. "Please tell Mr. Reynolds I'll see him at the bank on the 1st of the month, as scheduled." Sheriff Miller sighed. "Mrs. Morris, Tabitha, no one thinks you can make this work. John had trouble enough when he was alive. It's not shameful to admit defeat." "I haven't been defeated yet, Sheriff." Her voice was quiet but steel-edged. "Good day to you." After he'd gone, Tabitha leaned against the barn door, her brave face crumpling. The sheriff was right. Everyone in town thought she was a fool for trying to keep the ranch going. Maybe she was, but giving up meant giving up the last piece of John she had left. The next few days settled into a grueling rhythm, up before dawn to feed the animals, mend fences until midday, then ride into town for supplies she could barely afford. The general store owner, Mr. Finch, had started asking for payment up front, no longer extending credit the way he had when John was alive. "Just being practical, Mrs. Morris," he'd said with false sympathy. "Business is business." It was on one such trip to town, a week after the funeral, that Tabitha overheard the conversation that cut deeper than any knife. "That Morris widow's a stubborn fool," came a man's voice from the alley beside the mercantile. "Thinks she can run that ranch all by herself." "It's sad, really," a woman replied, Mrs. Baker, who sang in the church choir every Sunday. "Denial, that's what it is. She can't accept that John's gone. Someone ought to make her see reason before she loses everything," the man continued. "Keeping that ranch going is like hoping to catch rain in a sieve." Tabitha's hands tightened on her package of supplies. She wanted to confront them, to defend herself, but what could she say? That the ranch accounts were nearly empty? That she woke up every morning with aching muscles and blistered hands? Instead, she walked away, head high despite the tears threatening to spill. She mounted her mare and turned toward home, the afternoon sun beating down on her back. She was halfway home when she spotted something odd, a horse, saddled but riderless, grazing by the creek that ran through her property. Tabitha reined in, scanning the area with narrowed eyes. Rustlers were always a possibility, though she didn't have enough cattle left to tempt many. Cautiously she approached the creek, one hand on the small revolver John had insisted she learn to use. Then she saw him, a man lying motionless at the water's edge, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. Tabitha dismounted quickly, tying her horse to a nearby tree before hurrying over. The man was face down, his clothes dusty from the trail. A worn leather hat lay a few feet away, and a fine layer of trail dust covered his dark hair. "Sir," she called, keeping her distance. "Are you alive?" A groan answered her, and the man tried to roll over, then hissed in pain. "My leg," he managed. Tabitha knelt beside him, turning him carefully onto his back. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw and pain lines around his eyes. Those eyes opened now, startlingly green against his sun-darkened skin. "You're on Morris land," she informed him, maintaining a safe distance. "What happened?" "Horse spooked at a rattler," he said through gritted teeth. "Threw me hard. I think my leg's broken." Tabitha assessed the situation quickly. The man didn't look like a rustler, his clothes were worn but decent, and the gun belt at his hip held a Colt that had seen better days. More importantly, he was injured and needed help. "I'm Mrs. Morris," she said. "My ranch is about 2 miles east of here. Can you ride if I help you up?" He grimaced. "Quentin York," he replied. "And I can try, madam." Getting him onto his horse proved nearly impossible with his injured leg, so Tabitha made a quick decision. "I'll ride for help. You stay put." "No need to trouble yourself," York said, his face pale beneath his tan. "Just help me onto my horse. I'll manage." "Don't be ridiculous," Tabitha snapped, falling back on practicality in the face of crisis. "You'll fall and break your neck next. I'll be back within the hour." She rode hard back to the ranch, hitched the wagon as quickly as she could, and returned to find York exactly where she'd left him, though he'd managed to drag himself into the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Your leg needs to be set," she told him, as she helped him into the wagon bed, which she'd padded with a blanket. Each movement drew a sharp intake of breath from him, though he made no other sound of complaint. "I'm taking you to Dr. Wilson in town." "Much obliged, madam," York said, his voice tight, "though I hate to be a burden." "It's not a burden to help a person in need, Mr. York," Tabitha replied, as she climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. The doctor confirmed a clean break and set York's leg, splinting it carefully before turning to Tabitha with a concerned frown. "He'll need proper care for at least 6 weeks, Dr. Wilson said quietly. "I'd suggest the boarding house, but—" "I'll pay," York interrupted from the examination table. "Once I can send a wire—" "Nonsense," Tabitha heard herself say. "You were injured on my land. You'll stay at the ranch until you're mended." Dr. Wilson's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and York looked equally startled. "Mrs. Morris, that's not necessary," he began. "It's decided," Tabitha said firmly. "I have the space, and it's the Christian thing to do." Later, as they traveled slowly back to the ranch with York propped up in the wagon bed, Tabitha wondered at her own impulsiveness. A stranger, a man, no less staying at her home, would set the gossips' tongues wagging even faster. But something about leaving him alone at the boarding house had struck her as wrong. "I hope you don't mind the guest room downstairs," she said over her shoulder. "It's small, but you won't have to manage stairs." "Mrs. Morris," York said carefully, "you really don't have to do this. I understand your situation, a widow, living alone." "And what do you know of my situation, Mr. York?" Tabitha asked, perhaps more sharply than she intended. "Only what the doctor mentioned while you were paying him," York admitted, "that you're determined to keep your ranch going despite difficulties." Tabitha's shoulders stiffened. "Is that what he called it? Difficulties? Well, Mr. York, I assure you I'm perfectly capable of handling my difficulties and offering Christian charity to an injured traveler." York fell silent for a long moment. "Yes, madam," he finally said, "and I'm grateful." By the time they reached the ranch, dusk was falling. Getting York into the house proved another challenge, but they managed it together, his arm around her shoulders as he hopped awkwardly on his good leg. Tabitha tried to ignore the unfamiliar feeling of a man's weight against her side. It had been months since John had held her, even before the accident. The guest room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the yard. Tabitha helped York settle, brought him water and leftover stew, and finally retreated to her own room upstairs, exhausted but oddly energized. It was only as she prepared for bed that the full impact of her decision hit her. She had invited a stranger, a man she knew nothing about, into her home. John would have called it reckless. The townspeople would call it scandalous. Tabitha herself wasn't sure what to call it, except perhaps the first truly independent decision she'd made since becoming a widow. The next morning, Tabitha woke at her usual early hour, dressed quickly, and went downstairs to check on her patient before starting chores. She found the guest room empty, the bed neatly made. Alarmed, she hurried outside, only to find Quentin York seated on a stump near the chicken coop, awkwardly feeding the birds with his splinted leg stretched out before him. "Mr. York, what are you doing out of bed?" she demanded, hurrying over. He looked up, squinting against the early morning sun. "Couldn't sleep past dawn," he explained. "Figured I'd make myself useful by hobbling around on a broken leg. Dr. Wilson said you need rest." "Dr. Wilson doesn't know how much work a ranch takes," York replied. "I may not be able to ride or mend fences, but I can feed chickens sitting down." Tabitha stared at him, bemused. Most men would take the opportunity to be waited on hand and foot. A hint of a smile crossed his face. "I'm not most men, Mrs. Morris." Over the next few days, Tabitha discovered just how true that statement was. Despite his injury, Quentin York proved himself determined to earn his keep. He couldn't do much physical labor, but he kept the account books while she worked outside, pointing out ways she could economize. He had a quick mind for numbers and a practical approach to ranching that reminded her of John, though their personalities couldn't have been more different. Where John had been quiet and sometimes stern, York was thoughtful but quick to smile. He told stories in the evenings as they sat on the porch, tales of his travels across the Western Territories, working cattle drives and taking odd jobs. "Were you heading anywhere in particular when you were injured?" Tabitha asked one evening, a week after his arrival. York hesitated. "I'd heard they were hiring at the Palmer Ranch up north," he said. "Thought I'd try my luck there." "You're a cowhand, then?" "Among other things," he replied. "I've been riding herds since I was 16. Worked my way up to foreman on a spread in Texas before." He trailed off, his expression clouding. "Before?" Tabitha prompted. York shook his head. "Before I decided to see more of the country," he finished. But Tabitha sensed there was more to the story. The following day brought a visit from Sheriff Miller again, this time with a more official air. He glanced at York, who was whittling on the porch, before turning to Tabitha. "Mrs. Morris, I need to speak with you privately," he said, his tone serious. Tabitha led him into the kitchen, away from York's earshot. "What is it, Sheriff?" Miller removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I've had some inquiries about a man matching your guest's description. Quentin York, is that the name he gave you?" A chill ran through Tabitha. "Yes. Is something wrong?" "There was some trouble down in Wyoming," Miller said carefully. "A ranch foreman accused of theft. The description matches." "Theft? I don't believe it," Tabitha said immediately. "Mr. York has been nothing but helpful and honest since he arrived." "Be that as it may, I'd advise caution, Mrs. Morris. You're alone out here, and taking in strangers, especially men with questionable backgrounds, isn't wise." "Thank you for your concern, Sheriff," Tabitha said stiffly. "Is there an actual warrant for Mr. York's arrest?" Miller looked uncomfortable. "Not that I've seen, just rumors." "Then I'll thank you not to spread those rumors further," she replied. "Mr. York was injured on my property, and Christian charity demands I help him recover." After the sheriff left, Tabitha remained in the kitchen, her hands braced against the table. Should she confront York about his past? Part of her wanted to trust her instincts. The man had shown nothing but decency and respect during his stay. But another part, the practical widow who'd learned the hard way that life could be cruel, urged caution. Her thoughts were interrupted by York himself, standing in the doorway. Leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch he'd fashioned from a fence post, "The sheriff was asking about me," he said. It wasn't a question. Tabitha straightened, facing him squarely. "He mentioned some trouble in Wyoming." York nodded slowly, his expression grave. "I figured that would catch up eventually." "Is it true?" Tabitha asked directly. "Were you accused of theft?" "Yes," York replied without hesitation. "I was the foreman at the Diamond K Ranch. The owner, Kerrigan, accused me of stealing cattle when some went missing after a storm." "And did you?" His green eyes met hers steadily. "No, madam, I did not. But Kerrigan's word carried weight. And mine didn't. I left rather than face a hanging." "You ran," Tabitha said softly. "I chose to live," York corrected. "Those cattle were swept away in a flash flood. I tried to tell Kerrigan, but he'd been looking for an excuse. I'd confronted him about shorting the men's pay." Tabitha studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. "Why should I believe you?" York's shoulders slumped slightly. "You shouldn't, necessarily. You don't know me from Adam. But I give you my word, Mrs. Morris, I've never stolen anything in my life." There was something in his direct gaze that Tabitha found herself trusting, despite her better judgment. Perhaps it was because she knew what it felt like to have others doubt you, to have your word questioned. "I believe you," she said finally. "But if you're running from this accusation, you can't stay here indefinitely. People talk." "I know," York agreed. "As soon as my legs healed enough to travel, I'll move on. I don't want to bring trouble to your door." The weeks that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. York's leg began to heal, and he grew more mobile, able to help with small tasks around the ranch. Tabitha found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to having someone to discuss the day's challenges with. One evening in late October, as the first real chill of autumn settled over the land, York asked the question she'd been dreading. "Why are you so determined to keep this ranch, Mrs. Morris? Most widows in your position would sell and move back east to family." Tabitha was silent for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "I don't have family back east," she finally said. "My parents died when I was 18. I came west as a mail-order bride. John was a good man, steady and hard-working. This land was his dream." "And is it yours?" York pressed gently. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked what she wanted since John died. Everyone assumed she was clinging to the past, to John's memory. "I don't know," she admitted. "At first I just couldn't bear to let it go. It felt like giving up on everything John worked for. But now—" She gestured to the land spread out before them, the pastures turning golden in the fading light. "Now I think I stay because I want to prove I can, that I'm not just the widow Morris, an object of pity." York nodded, understanding in his eyes. "People underestimate what we're capable of when our backs are against the wall. The town thinks I'm a fool," Tabitha said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "A foolish woman hoping for the impossible." "Hope isn't foolish," York replied quietly. "Sometimes it's all we have." Their eyes met in the gathering darkness, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of shared understanding that went beyond words. Tabitha looked away first, suddenly aware of how improper it was to sit alone with this man in the twilight, sharing confidences. "It's getting late," she said, rising from her chair. "We should turn in?" York nodded, reaching for his crutch. "Thank you for the conversation, Mrs. Morris." "Tabitha," she found herself saying. "You might as well call me Tabitha after all this time." A smile spread across his face, warming his green eyes. "Then I'm Quentin, not Mr. York." That night, Tabitha lay awake longer than usual, her thoughts in turmoil. She was growing too comfortable with Quentin's presence, too accustomed to having him around. And worse, she was beginning to see him not just as a helpful presence, but as a man, a handsome, intelligent man, whose smile made her heart beat faster. It had been barely 4 months since she'd buried John. What kind of widow was she, to have such thoughts about another man? She turned restlessly in her bed, the guilt mixing with an undeniable awareness that her life had somehow brightened since Quentin York's arrival. The next morning brought the first snow of the season, a light dusting that would melt by noon, but served as a warning of the winter to come. Tabitha rose early and found Quentin already in the kitchen, a fire burning in the stove and coffee brewing. "You're up early," she observed, trying to ignore how domestic the scene felt. "Thought I'd make myself useful," he replied. "Weather's changing. You'll need to bring in more firewood today." "I was planning to ride into town," Tabitha said. "The loan payment is due tomorrow." Quentin nodded, his expression serious. "Will you have enough?" Tabitha hesitated. The truth was she would barely make the payment, and only by selling 2 of her best heifers the previous week, a short-sighted solution that would hurt the ranch's future. "I'll manage," she said. "Let me come with you," Quentin suggested. "My leg's strong enough for a trip to town now." "People will talk," Tabitha warned. He shrugged. "People always talk. But a woman traveling alone isn't as safe as one with a companion, especially carrying money for a bank payment." She couldn't argue with his logic, and truthfully, she welcomed the company. The road to town could be lonely, and the reception she received in Copper Creek had grown increasingly strained as locals waited for her inevitable failure. They set out after breakfast, Quentin riding his own horse with his splinted leg awkwardly extended. The journey took longer than usual to accommodate his injury, but Tabitha found she didn't mind. The morning was crisp and clear, the mountains sharp against the blue sky. "Have you lived in this area long?" Quentin asked as they rode. 6 years, Tabitha replied. "John brought me here right after we married. The ranch was much smaller than just a cabin and 40 acres. He built it up bit by bit." "He sounds like a determined man." "He was," Tabitha said softly. "Practical, hard-working. Not one for big dreams, except for this land. He loved it from the moment he saw it." "And you?" Tabitha considered the question. "I've grown to love it," she admitted. "Not at first it was so wild, so different from Cincinnati where I grew up. But now, I can't imagine being anywhere else." Their arrival in Copper Creek caused exactly the stir Tabitha had expected. Heads turned as they rode down Main Street, whispers following in their wake. Quentin seemed oblivious, but Tabitha felt every curious stare like a physical touch. At the bank, Mr. Reynolds barely concealed his surprise at seeing her with a companion. His eyes darted between them as Tabitha counted out the payment. "Mrs. Morris," he said when she'd finished, "might I have a word in private?" Quentin took the hint and stepped outside, leaving Tabitha facing the banker across his polished desk. "I see you've taken in a boarder," Reynolds said, his tone carefully neutral. "Mr. York was injured on my property," Tabitha explained. "He's recuperating." "I see." Reynolds leaned forward. "Mrs. Morris, Tabitha, you must be aware how this appears. A young widow living alone with a man of questionable character." "Mr. York's character is not in question," Tabitha interrupted, her voice cooling. "And my reputation is my own concern." "Perhaps, but the bank's reputation is mine," Reynolds countered. "We have extended considerable leniency given your circumstances, but if there's any hint of impropriety—" "Are you threatening to call in my loan?" Tabitha asked directly. Reynolds had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'm merely suggesting that appearances matter in a small community. Your husband was well respected. It would be a shame to tarnish his memory." Anger flared hot in Tabitha's chest. "John's memory isn't tarnished by an act of Christian charity," she said firmly. "Now, if there's nothing else, I have errands to complete." Outside, she found Quentin waiting patiently, his face impassive, though she suspected he'd heard every word through the thin walls. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly as they walked toward the general store. "Nothing I can't handle," Tabitha replied, but her hands were trembling slightly. Reynolds' veiled threat had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Their next stop was the general store, where Mr. Finch's wife served them with barely concealed disapproval. As Tabitha selected the few supplies she could afford, she overheard Mrs. Finch whispering to another customer, "Living in sin, that's what it is. Her poor husband barely cold in his grave." Heat flooded Tabitha's face. She nearly abandoned her purchases and fled, but Quentin's steady presence beside her gave her strength. He stepped forward, addressing Mrs. Finch directly. "Madam," he said, his voice pitched to carry, "I'd appreciate if you'd refrain from spreading falsehoods about Mrs. Morris. She generously offered shelter to an injured traveler, at considerable inconvenience to herself. Where I come from, that's called Christian charity, not sin." Mrs. Finch sputtered, red-faced, but Quentin continued calmly. Now, I believe we need a pound of coffee and some sugar, if you'd be so kind." The rest of their transaction proceeded in tense silence. Outside, Tabitha finally found her voice. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Quentin replied simply. "You've shown me nothing but kindness. I won't stand by while people question your character for it." Their ride home was quieter, both lost in thought. As the ranch came into view, Quentin broke the silence. "I should leave soon," he said. "My presence is causing you difficulty." Tabitha knew he was right, but the thought of returning to her solitary existence made her heart sink. "Your leg isn't fully healed," she protested weakly. "It's strong enough," he countered, "and winter's coming. I should move on before the passes get snowed in." That evening, as Tabitha prepared supper, she fought against a growing sense of melancholy. Quentin would leave, the gossip would die down, and she would be alone again with her impossible task. The bank would eventually foreclose, and everything John had built would be lost. "You're awfully quiet," Quentin observed as they ate. Tabitha managed a smile. "Just tired. It was a long day." "Reynolds gave you trouble about the loan?" She hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding the truth. "Not directly, but he made it clear that my situation was causing concern." Quentin set down his fork. "I'm sorry, Tabitha. That's my fault." "No," she said firmly. "It's this town's fault. They've been waiting for me to fail since the day John died. If it wasn't you staying here, they'd find something else to criticize." "Still," Quentin said, "I'll be gone by the end of the week. Give your neighbors less to gossip about." The thought brought a hollow feeling to Tabitha's chest. "Where will you go?" "North, probably. Find work for the winter, then head to Colorado in the spring. There's good ranching country there." Tabitha nodded, trying to appear composed. "Well, you're welcome to stay until you're fully recovered, despite what the town thinks." Quentin studied her face for a long moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What will you do when the money runs out? It's coming, Tabitha. I've seen your books." The blunt question caught her off guard. No one had dared to be so direct before. I don't know," she admitted. "Keep going as long as I can." "I suppose." "And then?" She shook her head. "There is no then. This ranch is all I have." Quentin leaned forward, his expression intent. "That's not true. You have skills, intelligence, determination. You could start fresh somewhere." "As what? A spinster schoolteacher? A seamstress?" Tabitha laughed without humor. "Those are the respectable options for a widow without means." "Or as a rancher," Quentin said quietly. "In new territory, with better land and a fresh start." Tabitha stared at him. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," he replied. "Just pointing out that your life doesn't have to end if you lose this particular piece of land." His words stayed with Tabitha long after they had finished supper and retired to their separate rooms. Was she clinging to the ranch out of loyalty to John or fear of the unknown? She'd come west as a bride, stepping into a life someone else had chosen. Perhaps holding on to the ranch was just another way of avoiding making her own choices. The next morning brought unseasonably heavy snow, 6 inches by dawn, with more falling steadily. Tabitha rose early to feed the livestock, struggling through drifts that reached her knees in places. By the time she returned to the house, her fingers were numb despite her gloves. Quentin was waiting with hot coffee. "This is just the start," he warned. "Storm like this in October means a hard winter coming." Tabitha nodded, warming her hands on the mug. "The cattle will need extra feed. I'll have to break into the winter stores early." "Do you have enough?" She hesitated. "Not if the winter's as bad as you think." Quentin's expression grew serious. "Tabitha, I don't mean to overstep, but you need to consider selling some of the herd now while they're still healthy. Keep just what you can comfortably feed through winter." It was sensible advice, but the thought of reducing her already small herd cut deep. Every animal sold was another step toward failure. "I'll think about it," she said, though they both knew she had little choice. The snow continued all day, confining them to the house. Tabitha used the time to mend clothes and take inventory of her pantry, while Quentin repaired a broken chair and several tools. By evening, the domestic rhythm felt so natural that Tabitha caught herself imagining a future where such days were common. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead it brought a quiet contentment. Quentin York was nothing like John, where her husband had been reserved and sometimes stern. Quentin was open and quick to smile. John had been driven by duty. Quentin seemed guided by a deeper understanding of people. After supper, they sat before the fire, the howling wind outside making the warmth of the room more precious. "Tell me about your life before Wyoming," Tabitha said impulsively. "You've never really said where you're from." Quentin smiled faintly. "No great mystery there. Born in Pennsylvania, headed west when I was 16 after my mother died. My father was a blacksmith good man, but hard. We didn't see eye to eye on much." "You never went back?" He shook his head. "Nothing to go back to. Pa died about 10 years ago, according to a letter I got. No siblings, no other family to speak of." "So you've been alone," Tabitha said softly. "Mostly," he agreed. "Though not lonely, generally. Ranch work keeps you surrounded by people, even if they're not family." "And you never married?" The question was too personal, but the firelight and isolation made ordinary boundaries seem distant. Quentin was quiet for a moment. "Came close once," he finally said. "Girl named Sarah, back in Texas. Her father owned the ranch where I worked. What happened? Her father decided a foreman wasn't good enough for his daughter," Quentin said with a shrug that didn't quite hide the old hurt. "Offered me money to move on. I refused the money, but left anyway. Sarah didn't fight for me, so I figured she agreed with him." "I'm sorry," Tabitha said. Quentin's smile returned, though his eyes remained somber. "Ancient history now. What about you? How did you end up a mail-order bride?" It was Tabitha's turn to look away. "My parents died within months of each other. Influenza. I was teaching at a small school, but the pay barely covered room and board. When I saw John's advertisement in the newspaper, a rancher seeking a wife, it seemed like providence, a chance at a real home again." "Was it a good marriage?" Quentin asked carefully. Tabitha considered the question. "It was comfortable," she said finally. "John was kind in his way, not demonstrative but steady. He wanted children, but—" She trailed off, the old pain resurfacing. "It wasn't meant to be, apparently." They fell silent, watching the fire together. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small ranch house, Tabitha felt a curious peace. For the first time since John's death, she wasn't alone with her grief and fear. "I should turn in," she said eventually, rising from her chair. "Morning comes early, storm or no storm." Quentin nodded. "Good night, Tabitha." She paused at the foot of the stairs, looking back at him. "Quentin, thank you, for the conversation, for your help, for everything." His smile warmed his entire face. "No thanks needed. If anything, I'm in your debt." The storm lasted 3 days, dropping nearly 2 feet of snow before moving east. When it finally cleared, Tabitha and Quentin ventured out to assess the damage. One of the smaller outbuildings had partially collapsed under the snow's weight, and a section of fence was down, but overall, the ranch had weathered the storm well. The cattle, however, looked thin and miserable. Tabitha's heart sank as she surveyed the herd. "You were right," she told Quentin as they trudged back to the house. "I need to sell most of them before winter sets in properly." He nodded, his expression sympathetic. "It's the right decision, Tabitha. You can rebuild the herd in the spring." If she still had the ranch in the spring, Tabitha thought, but didn't say. Instead, she focused on the practical. "The snow needs to melt enough for travel before I can drive them to town. Might take a week," Quentin estimated, looking at the drifts. "But we can start preparing now." The "we" caught Tabitha's attention. "I thought you were leaving." Quentin hesitated. "I can't very well abandon you right after a blizzard," he said. "At least let me help you get the cattle to market, then I'll move on." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by guilt. She shouldn't be glad for reasons to keep him here longer. "If you're sure," she said carefully. "I would appreciate the help." The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as they repaired storm damage and prepared for the cattle drive. Quentin's leg had healed enough that he could ride properly, though he still favored it when walking. Together, they mapped out the most efficient route to town and decided which animals to keep just 10 of the strongest cows and the lone bull. Working side by side, Tabitha found herself watching Quentin when he wasn't looking, the competent way he handled tools, the gentle patience he showed with the animals, the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his dark hair. More than once, she caught herself wondering what it would be like to be held by those strong arms, to be the focus of those intelligent green eyes in moments of intimacy rather than conversation. Such thoughts were scandalous for a widow, not yet 6 months out from her husband's funeral, but they persisted nonetheless. Tabitha tried to push them away, focusing instead on the practicalities of saving her ranch. The day before they planned to drive the cattle to town, Sheriff Miller rode up, his expression grim. Tabitha's heart sank as she saw him approach. More trouble about Quentin, no doubt. "Mrs. Morris," the sheriff greeted her, tipping his hat. "Mr. York." "Sheriff," Tabitha replied, "what brings you out in such conditions?" Miller dismounted stiffly. "Got word from Wyoming," he said, looking directly at Quentin. "Seems the situation has changed, York." Quentin straightened, wariness crossing his features. "How so?" "The ranch owner who accused you, Kerrigan, he's dead. Shot in a dispute over cards, according to the telegram." Tabitha glanced at Quentin, whose face had gone still. "I'm sorry to hear it," he said carefully, "but I don't see how that changes anything for me." "Before he died, he admitted to several falsehoods," Miller continued, "including the accusation against you. Seems he was rustling his own cattle to sell across the territory line and needed a scapegoat." Quentin's shoulders sagged slightly, the only visible sign of his relief. "Well," he said after a moment, "that's something at least." "It means you're a free man," Miller clarified. "No charges outstanding. Thought you'd want to know." "Thank you, Sheriff," Tabitha said when Quentin remained silent. "That's good news indeed." After Miller left, Quentin stood motionless in the yard, staring at the distant mountains. Tabitha approached him cautiously. "Are you all right?" He turned to her, a complex mix of emotions crossing his face. "I never expected to be cleared," he admitted. "I'd made peace with always looking over my shoulder." "You could go back to Wyoming now," Tabitha suggested, though the words hurt to say. "Reclaim your reputation." Quentin shook his head. "Nothing for me there, but—" he hesitated. "It does change things. A man with a criminal shadow isn't much good to anyone. A man with a clean name has more options." "Options for what?" Tabitha asked, her heart beating faster. But Quentin only smiled faintly. "Let's get through this cattle drive first, one thing at a time." The drive to town the next day was slow, but steady. The 20 cattle they had selected for sale moved reluctantly through the partially melted snow, requiring constant attention to keep them on course. By the time they reached Copper Creek, both Tabitha and Quentin were exhausted and mud-splattered. The cattle buyer, a gruff man named Holloway, inspected the animals with a critical eye before making his offer. It was lower than Tabitha had hoped, but she'd expected as much. Winter was coming, and feed would be expensive. No one wanted to take on extra mouths. "It's the best you'll get before spring," Holloway told her bluntly. "Take it or drive them back home." Tabitha nodded, accepting the inevitable. The money would be enough to make the next loan payment and perhaps the one after that, if she was extremely careful. But by spring, she'd be in the same precarious position, with a herd too small to generate meaningful income. As they led their horses from the livery stable after concluding the sale, Tabitha was surprised to see Mr. Reynolds waiting for them outside the bank. "Mrs. Morris," he called, waving her over. "A word, if you please." Quentin tensed beside her. "Want me to come with you?" Tabitha shook her head. "I can handle Reynolds." "Why don't you check the general store for any supplies we need?" Reynolds led her into his office, closing the door with deliberate care. "I see you've sold most of your herd," he began without preamble. "News travels fast," Tabitha remarked dryly. "It's a small town," Reynolds replied. "Mrs. Morris, I'll be direct. The bank is concerned about your ability to maintain loan payments through the winter and spring." Tabitha straightened her spine. "I've never missed a payment, Mr. Reynolds." "No, but you've been selling assets to make those payments assets that generate the income needed for future payments. It's an unsustainable approach." She couldn't argue with his logic, but surrender wasn't in her nature. "I'll rebuild the herd in spring." Reynolds sighed. "With what capital? Mrs. Morris, Tabitha. I'm not trying to be cruel, but the bank has investors to answer to. We need to discuss realistic options." "You want me to sell?" Tabitha said flatly. "I want you to consider it," Reynolds corrected, "before winter truly sets in and depresses property values further. I've had an inquiry from the Palmer Ranch. They're looking to expand and might offer a fair price." The Palmer Ranch, the very place Quentin had been heading when he was injured. The coincidence gave Tabitha pause. "I need time to consider," she said finally. Reynolds nodded. "Of course, but don't wait too long. Winter's coming early this year, by all accounts." Outside, Tabitha found Quentin waiting, a small package under his arm. His expression told her he'd heard at least part of the conversation. "The Palmer Ranch?" he asked quietly as they walked toward their horses. "You heard." "Hard not to. The walls in that bank are thin." Quentin hesitated. "Tabitha, there's something you should know. I wasn't entirely forthcoming about my destination when I was injured." Tabitha stopped walking, turning to face him. "What do you mean?" "I wasn't just looking for work at the Palmer Ranch," Quentin admitted. "I was going to see about buying into it as a partner. I have some savings money I've been putting aside for years." Surprise rendered Tabitha momentarily speechless. "You're a rancher in your own right." "Not yet," Quentin said. "But that's been the plan. Save enough to buy in somewhere, build something that's partly mine at least." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Quentin looked uncomfortable. At first it didn't seem relevant. Later, well, it would have felt like I was offering a solution that might seem self-serving. "I don't understand," he sighed. "Tabitha, your ranch has good bones, but it's struggling. The land is decent but not exceptional. The Palmer property is prime grazing land with reliable water sources. If you sold to them and took the money, I could start over somewhere else," Tabitha finished slowly. "That's what you were hinting at before." Quentin nodded. "It wouldn't be admitting defeat. It would be making a strategic retreat to fight another day." The idea was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Leave Copper Creek, the place where everyone saw her as poor widow Morris. Start fresh somewhere. People didn't know her story, her struggles. "I need to think," she said finally. "This isn't a decision to make hastily." The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As the ranch came into view, Tabitha found herself seeing it with new eyes, not as John's dream that she was duty-bound to preserve, but as a property with strengths and weaknesses, assets and liabilities. That evening, after a simple supper, Quentin handed her the small package he'd purchased in town. "What's this?" Tabitha asked, surprised. "Open it," he urged. Inside the brown paper was a journal, its leather cover tooled with a simple geometric pattern. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the design. "But why?" "I thought you might want to write down your thoughts," Quentin explained. "Work through your decision about the ranch. Sometimes seeing things on paper makes them clearer." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said softly. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Quentin said, his tone growing more serious. "With my name cleared, I've been reconsidering my plans." Tabitha's heart beat faster. "Oh, the Palmer Ranch is still looking for a partner," he said carefully. "But there are other opportunities too. Land farther west, in Montana territory, going for reasonable prices. Good cattle country with fewer established operations competing." "You're thinking of homesteading?" Tabitha asked. Quentin nodded. "Starting something from scratch rather than buying into an existing operation." He paused. "It would be a challenge, hard work, especially at the beginning." "Most worthwhile things are," Tabitha said. "Yes." Quentin met her eyes directly. "Tabitha, I know this is forward and perhaps inappropriate given your recent loss. But I've grown to care for you deeply these past weeks." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and fragile. Tabitha's breath caught in her throat. "I'm not asking for anything now," Quentin continued quickly. "Just for you to know that if you decide to sell this place and start fresh elsewhere, you wouldn't have to do it alone." Tears pricked at Tabitha's eyes. "Quentin, you don't need to answer," he said gently. "Take your time. Think about what you truly want, not what you feel obligated to do." That night, Tabitha sat up late, the new journal open on her lap. She wrote page after page about John, about the ranch, about her fears and hopes, and about Quentin York, the man who had arrived in her life by accident and changed everything. Was it disloyal to John's memory to consider selling the ranch? To consider a future with another man? The questions had no easy answers, but as Tabitha wrote, she began to see patterns in her own thoughts how she'd been defining herself through John's dreams rather than discovering her own. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Tabitha rose early, her decision made after a night of reflection. She found Quentin in the barn, already tending to the horses. "Good morning," he greeted her, a question in his eyes. "I've been thinking," Tabitha said without preamble, "about everything the ranch, the future, what you said last night." Quentin set down the brush he'd been using on his horse. "And I'm going to sell," she said firmly. "Not because I've failed, but because it's the right business decision. This land was John's dream, not mine. I've been trying to preserve something for his sake, not my own." Relief and something like hope crossed Quentin's face. "I think that's wise," he said carefully. "A fresh start." "Yes?" Tabitha took a deep breath. "As for the other matter, Quentin, I care for you too, more than I thought possible after losing John. But everything has happened so quickly." "I understand," he said, his voice gentle. "There's no rush, Tabitha. Whatever you decide about your future, I respect your need for time." Tabitha stepped closer to him, her heart racing. "I don't want to wait too long," she admitted. "Life is uncertain, I learned that when John died. But I do need to do this properly, to honor his memory and give myself time to be sure." Quentin nodded, his green eyes warm with understanding. "Then we'll take it one day at a time. I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." The words were simple, but they filled Tabitha with a profound sense of peace. For the first time since John's death, she was making choices based on her own desires, not obligation or fear. "Then stay," she said softly. "Help me sell this place and plan what comes next." Quentin's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "It would be my honor, Tabitha Morris." The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Tabitha contacted Reynolds about the Palmer Ranch's interest, and negotiations began in earnest. To her surprise, the offer was more generous than she'd expected, enough to pay off the loan and leave a substantial sum for a fresh start elsewhere. Meanwhile, Quentin sent telegrams to contacts throughout the Western Territories, inquiring about land for sale. Reports came back of promising opportunities in western Montana, where the railroad was expanding and cattle operations were still finding their footing. As they worked side by side to prepare the ranch for sale, their relationship deepened. Tabitha found herself laughing more, the weight of grief and worry gradually lifting from her shoulders. Quentin was unfailingly respectful of her need for time, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. But his feelings were evident in 1,000 small gestures. A hand offered to help her down from the wagon, coffee prepared just the way she liked it in the morning, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. The town's attitude shifted too. Once word spread that the Palmer Ranch was buying the Morris property. Suddenly, Tabitha wasn't a foolish widow clinging to an impossible dream, but a shrewd businesswoman making a smart transaction. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on her, but she found she no longer cared for Copper Creek's approval. By mid-December, the sale was finalized. Tabitha would stay through the winter, managing the property for the Palmers until spring made travel easier. Then, she would be free to start anew. The evening after signing the final papers, she and Quentin celebrated with a special supper. He'd ridden to town that morning and returned with luxuries they normally couldn't afford, a bottle of decent wine, a cut of beef finer than their usual fare, even a small cake from the bakery. "To new beginnings," Quentin toasted, raising his glass. "New beginnings," Tabitha echoed, her heart full. After they'd eaten, they sat before the fire, as had become their custom. Outside, snow fell gently, cocooning the ranch house in peaceful silence. "I've been thinking," Quentin said after a while, "about Montana." Tabitha looked up from the flames. "What about it?" "I received a letter yesterday from a friend who settled near Bozeman. He says there's a small ranch for sale, 300 acres with good water rights. The owner's getting on in years, no children to take over." "It sounds promising," Tabitha said. "Is that where you'll go in spring?" Quentin hesitated. I was hoping That is, I wondered if you might consider coming with me, to see it at least. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Tabitha had known this conversation was coming, had prepared for it, yet still found herself breathless with the reality of it. As what, Quentin? She asked softly. Your business partner? Your friend? He set down his wineglass and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. As my wife, if you'll have me, he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I know it's soon, and I know John's memory is still fresh, but I love you, Tabitha Morris. I think I've loved you since that first week, watching you fight for this place with everything you had. Tears blurred Tabitha's vision. People will talk, she whispered, a widow remarrying so quickly. Let them, Quentin replied. We'll be gone from here, starting fresh where no one knows our story but us. And what is our story? Tabitha asked, a smile beginning to form despite her tears. Quentin's answering smile was radiant. That a widow was called a fool for hoping, but a cowboy said her hope is what saved him, because it did, Tabitha. Finding you, being here when I was broken, it saved me in ways I never expected. Tabitha freed one hand to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. Ask me properly, Quentin York. He took a deep breath. Tabitha Morris, will you marry me? Come to Montana and build something new together? Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded with unexpected hunger. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth between them. We should wait until spring, Tabitha said, practicality reasserting itself. Do things properly. Quentin nodded, though reluctance showed in his eyes. Whatever you think best. The town will still talk, she added with a small smile. But I find I care less and less what they think. That's my girl, Quentin said softly, and the simple phrase sent warmth cascading through her. Winter passed in a blur of planning and quiet joy. They were careful to maintain propriety. Quentin moved to the bunkhouse despite the cold, insisting that Tabitha's reputation would be intact when they left Copper Creek. Their engagement became public knowledge, generating exactly the gossip they had expected, but also surprising support from unexpected quarters. Dr. Wilson stopped by one snowy afternoon, ostensibly to check Quentin's leg, but really to offer his congratulations. Been hoping this would happen, he admitted with a smile. Town needs more love stories and fewer tragedies. Even Sheriff Miller seemed pleased for them, though he maintained his gruff exterior. York's a good man, he told Tabitha when she visited town for supplies. Don't let the busybodies tell you different. As February turned to March and the first hints of spring softened the landscape, Tabitha found herself looking forward rather than back. The grief for John remained, but it had transformed into something gentler appreciation for the years they had shared, rather than anguish over what was lost. They were married on the first truly warm day of spring, a simple ceremony in the small church with just a handful of witnesses. Tabitha wore a dress of soft blue rather than traditional white, acknowledging her past while embracing her future. Quentin couldn't take his eyes off her. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, he whispered as they stood before the preacher. The reception was brief, just cake and coffee at the hotel dining room. By mid-afternoon, they were on their way, belongings packed in a wagon, heading northwest toward Montana Territory and their new beginning. Their first night as husband and wife was spent under canvas stars, their bedroll spread beneath a canopy of early leaves. Tabitha's nervousness melted away in the face of Quentin's tender patience, his hands and lips teaching her that physical love could be more than duty. When they finally joined, it was with a sense of rightness, of coming home to something she hadn't known she was missing. I love you, she told him afterward, the words still new enough to make her heart race. I never thought I'd feel this way again. Quentin pulled her closer, his arm secure around her waist. Hope is a powerful thing, he murmured against her hair. You taught me that. The journey to Montana took nearly 3 weeks. The wagon slowing their progress, but allowing them to bring essentials for their new home. They traveled through breathtaking country mountains and valleys, rushing rivers and vast plains. Each night brought them closer. Stories shared over campfires, dreams discussed beneath stars. The ranch near Bozeman proved everything Quentin's friend had promised: good land, with a small but solid house, a barn in decent repair, and enough acreage to build a respectable herd over time. Using the money from the Morris ranch sale, they made the purchase and still had enough left to buy cattle and necessary supplies. By midsummer, they were established, the days full of hard work and the nights full of each other. The local community welcomed them without the baggage of their past, accepting them simply as the Yorks, the new ranchers from Colorado. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Quentin took Tabitha's hand. "Regrets?" he asked softly. She shook her head, leaning against his shoulder. "Not one. You?" "Only that I didn't meet you sooner," he replied, "though perhaps everything happened exactly when it needed to." Tabitha thought about the path that had brought them together: John's death, her stubborn hope, Quentin's accident, so much pain and loss, yet leading to this moment of perfect contentment. "The townspeople in Copper Creek called me a fool," she reflected, "for hoping I could keep John's ranch going." Quentin's arm tightened around her. "They were wrong. Your hope is what saved me, Tabitha. I was drifting, running from the past. You gave me a reason to stop, to build something lasting." She turned to kiss him, still marveling at the freedom to do so whenever she wished. "We saved each other, I think." As night fell over their new land, stars appearing one by one in the vast Montana sky, Tabitha York felt the last lingering doubts fade away. She had not betrayed John's memory by finding love again, but honored the most important lesson of his loss, that life was too precious to waste in fear or regret. Hope had been her compass in the darkest days, guiding her to this new beginning. It had transformed her from a widow struggling to preserve the past into a woman embracing her future. The people of Copper Creek might never understand, but she no longer needed their approval. She had found her home, not in a piece of land, but in Quentin's steadfast love, and that was worth every hardship, every whispered criticism, every moment of doubt. As she followed her husband into their house, Tabitha smiled at the thought that sometimes the fools turn out to be the wisest of all.